Being Latin American is particularly important to me, and even though I was raised in Canada since I was a year and a half old, I try to have a deep appreciation and understanding for the culture that I'm from. When I was a teenager who was attempting to understand ethnic identity, the idea of being Latino seemed like it was a culture of sunshine and bliss, where everyone got along, despite the differences in race and culture, sort of like a Mark Anthony music video. However, in educating myself about Latin American history, politics, affairs, as well as learning from various family members and visiting different places in Latin America myself, I learned that I was naive. Indeed, Latin America is a beautiful place with various vibrant and diverse cultures, and now with more international and mainstream spotlight on different aspects of the culture than ever before. However, when it comes to the idea of being labeled Latin American, and more specifically the idea of Latinidad, it's clear to me now that the connotations and expectations of such serve a narrow and privileged demographic, while erasing the experiences of many people who don't feel represented by this label, specifically Black and Indigenous Latin Americans, who to this day face constant discrimination on many levels, such as social structures, the media, and politics. I will be focusing on examples that fall into these three facets, specifically on the language and rhetoric used around Blackness and indigeneity, their representation in the media, and how systemic racism still oppresses these marginalized groups. First off, I'm going to explain Latinidad, as I will be mentioning it often in this essay. Latinidad is a term used to describe a sense of commonness and unity between the countries of Latin America, due to similarities in geographical region, culture, experience, and language. It is often used to paint this picture of what a Latin American person is, and also carries expectations of what they should look like. The thing is that this Latinidad looks pretty white, and it erases the vast amount of inequity across the region, as well as the oppression still faced by many. When it comes to the language used to describe Blackness and indigeneity in Latin America, there's a common pattern where things associated with being Black or indigenous are seen as bad or undesirable. When it comes to hair, for example, some hairdressers will blatantly refer to curly hair with the tight and kinky curls as pelo malo, meaning bad hair, whereas straight hair is referred to as pelo bueno, meaning good hair. Some will also even refer to tight curly hair as pelo chino, chino being a shortened version of the word cochino, meaning pig, and this is because it is comparing the hair of a person with tight, curly coils to the coil of a pig's tail. The word indio, short for indigeno, is commonly used as an insult when someone is acting recklessly or if they lack manners, and this is a clear continuation of the colonial narrative that indigenous people are primitive and uncivilized. These are just some examples of how colonial rhetoric was and is used to put down Black and indigenous people in Latin America, and the list of microaggressions like these just goes on and on. However, when we look at the way that the words surrounding whiteness are used, their connotations are generally positive. The word güerito is used to describe white and lighter skinned people, typically in Mexico, but it is also used as a sort of way to address someone respectfully and or with high regard. Here, UCLA sociolinguist Dr. Armando Guerrero and Curly Velasquez from Pero Like explain and compare the connotations with the terms güerito and indio.
Güero is something that we almost use as an automatic thing. One of those contexts is in the context of service. So where you would hear it a lot, or where you will hear it a lot in Mexico in particular, it's going to be when you go to the mercado. And as you're walking around and people want to catch your attention so that you can patronize their local, their place of business, they're going to refer to you as güero. They're going to make this dynamic very clear, where I'm servicing you and I'm referencing you to the term that I have for whiteness. These terms that we use, in this term that we're using in particular, that's what it's doing. It's still alluding to whiteness and what whiteness means, right? And it's doing it almost in a hidden way.
Like, people will use it more as like a compliment. It's like a good thing. It's a nice thing. Because indio, on the flip, is used very much as a diss.
And everything associated with that human being. Because that's what we're doing with the use of a word like indio. right, in its derogatory fashion. And again, it's doing the same process that we've been talking about. It's creating a certain image, it's creating certain contrast, and at the same time, it's also erasing or deleting other reality.
These are clear indications of how these ways to think about race are embedded in Latin American language and culture. These are words that you would hear every day and not think twice about what you're really saying, and how it's keeping alive colonial ideas meant to oppress others that aren't white. It becomes even clearer with sayings such as mejorar la raza, which literally means improve the race. And this is used when someone is in a relationship and is having a child with someone that has lighter skin, thus whitening the lineage of a family and quote-unquote improving the race. And not to mention that many Latin Americans who don't speak Spanish or Portuguese have to continually be told and made to feel like they aren't Latin American enough, due to not knowing the language that was originally forced onto them by colonizers. This is something that Black Latin Americans have to deal with a lot more due to already not fitting the mold of Latinidad by being Black. And even if you do speak Spanish or Portuguese, the dialects of these languages that have more African influence in them, typically in the Caribbean and parts of Brazil, are subject to criticism and associations with lower intellect in comparison with how Spanish is supposed to be spoken and understood. Through manifestations of colonial notions of race and white supremacy such as these, it is clear that the way many Latin Americans are taught to use and think about language remain instilled with racist rhetoric disguised as casual conversation. Dr. Armando Guerrero has an eloquent quote on the topic. Language will forever represent a unique geographic, landscape, and socio-cultural history, including that of a colonized people and their colonizer. In the mainstream, both in and outside of Latin America, the presence of Black Latin Americans is disproportionately low. In fact, the majority of Latin American presence in the media is what Latinidad looks like, white. Even though many aspects of popular Latin American culture come directly from Black and Indigenous people, the face of these facets in the mainstream is almost always white. And when there is representation, there is still blatant racism, as explained by Feliz Leon and Janelle Martinez.
Can you speak to some specific ways that we've seen this anti-Blackness in pop culture?
I think Spanish language media has very blatant issues. You can still, on occasion, see blackface, people in Espanol. They always come out with their 50 most beautiful people issue. This year they had Yalitza Aparicio, who is the amazing indigenous actress. In past years, of course, they have like Zoe Saldana, amongst others, but to also send out that intentional message that there can only be one at a time really sends a strong message not only to the consumers of the magazine, but this next generation.
And the message is that you're an afterthought, if even considered at all.
The majority of attention and proper representation is continually given to lighter skinned and white people, while Black and Indigenous people are limited in how much they are represented and how they are allowed to represent themselves. There are even cases of straight up racism whenever there is representation in the media, such as the case of Nayara Justino, a Brazilian actress and model who in 2013 was crowned Globalese's Carnival Queen and was the first dark-skinned woman to win. Immediately after being crowned, she was subject to online harassment, threats, and racism. And because of it, she was actually dethroned and the title was given to another lighter-skinned model. Here she is, along with her hairdresser, touching on the lack of representation of Black people in Brazilian media and the schooling system and how it affects them growing up.
A população negra no Brasil, ela é a maioria. E não é isso que a gente vê na TV.
E desde cedo também na escola, né? Quando você era pequena, por exemplo, não tinha uma boneca negra.
Não tinha.
Na escola, quando você é pequena, você tem a referência que você tem que alisar o cabelo.
É, porque todas as bonecas são loiras, cabelo liso ali, bonitinha e tal. E a gente não tinha isso. Ainda é complicado, ainda muita gente, como eu disse, tem algumas amigas minhas que foram se descobrir negras com 20, 23 anos.
Tem que ser a base, de pequeno, tem que ser na escola, tem que mudar tudo na escola. Hoje a gente tem algumas mulheres negras igual a Nayara, graças a Deus, que são os pontos de referência das mulheres negras no Brasil. Então, quero agradecer a Nayara, que esse é um grande ponto de referência, muito bom. Já é uma evolução muito grande.
Lack of proper representation can lead to self-hatred due to feeling like you're not what is considered desirable and valid, something that has prompted many Black and Indigenous people to attempt to change how they present themselves by things such as whitening their skin in order to attempt to appeal to the molds set by white supremacy and colonization. These are just some of the reasons why the media in Latin America have continuously made Black and Indigenous people feel as if they are not valid and not allowed to be a part of Latin American culture and represent themselves how they want. One of the primary reasons as to why there still exists many manifestations of white supremacy across Latin American societies is because governments across the region have either lent a blind eye to the issues faced by Black and Indigenous people or implemented laws to oppress them. This oppression stemming from the colonization of Latin America and the transatlantic slave trade, which brought approximately 10.7 enslaved Africans to the Americas, who after emancipation continue to face oppression. In colonial times, a racial caste system was implemented in order to keep white people at the top of the hierarchy, and the darker you were, the closer to the bottom of the caste you were labeled. What we then see is the colonial notions of race and white supremacy continue to make its way into the structures of Latin American politics.
Given this obsession with whiteness, it's no surprise that throughout Latin America, there were government-led efforts to make countries majority white. In Brazil, it was called branqueamento, and in many parts of Latin America, blanqueamento. The term literally means whitening.
But what is fascinating to note is that after the emancipation of slavery, what you instead see is a turn to the use of immigration law to diminish the access and the mobility of recently emancipated slaves. Like in Argentina and in Brazil in particular, where they had the funding for this, they sort of opened the doors to European immigration.
Beyond bringing Europeans into Latin American countries to literally lighten the race, Hernandez also said that there were restrictions on the lives of people of African ancestry, like the types of jobs Black people could work, the Afro-spiritual religions that they practiced, and even the quality of their education. So, Latin America, y'all think that you're not guilty of institutionalized racism led by the hand of law?
Nowadays, when you look at nations in this region, the poorest and most marginalized areas of these countries are usually the areas of the country with higher populations of Black and Indigenous people. Look at this map of my home country of Colombia. It highlights different poverty rates across each department, which is our version of a state or province. The ones in green are mainly rainforests with very small, typically indigenous populations, so there isn't enough data to make an estimate. However, it should be noted that the rural and countryside areas are typically the most impoverished in the country. Here you can see that even though poverty is something commonly seen all over the country, the rates of it are substantially higher in areas around the coast and deeper into the Amazon, and generally everything far away from the capital, Bogota. Now, when you look at these maps displaying the populations of Afro-Colombians and Indigenous Colombians, it is clear that these are the groups of people who suffer the most from poverty. To make matters worse, these are also the same areas that see the most amount of violence regarding the ongoing Colombian conflict, dating back decades and involving far-right paramilitary groups, guerrilla groups, and drug traffickers. The Colombian government has continuously done a poor job in addressing the disparity in these areas, and as of recently, the residents of a particular city on the west coast of the country, Buenaventura, have begun to call out the government for their lack of interest in bettering the region, which sees a lot of poverty and violence despite being a critical port city where a great deal of international imports come into the country. And the people who have been leading this movement to get the government to do something about it is led by majority Black and Indigenous people of the region. So when it comes to the governments of Latin America, that is, those who have the power and influence to make change, it seems as though they are not concerned with the issues faced by Black and Indigenous people, and how there are still laws and policies put in place in order to keep them marginalized and generally make their lives much harder than those with more privilege. Racism is something that many across the world still believe no longer exists, and people in Latin America are no exception. But when really looking at what is still going on in Black and Indigenous communities in the region and around the world, it's clear that there are many disadvantages faced exclusively by these people. There does exist movements and demonstrations that are fighting for equality. However, governments for the most part seem to not care, and this is why people are calling for reform in order to start seeing change for the better, because otherwise the world will continue falling into the same cycles of oppression that have existed for centuries.